Oops, forgot to put my camera on there. Sorry about that. Hi, Jack Chew here, chewing it over. Let me get myself in frame. Clumsy of me. So there we go. Nice to see you. Tuning in 12:30 till 1 o'clock weekdays, and we chew over whatever is topical at the time. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is something that's been cropping up as questions and comments from many of you, is how do we handle and deal with various biases? And that's types of biases and personal ones, and how might we handle that? How might we handle disagreement with an acknowledgement and recognition of various different parts of bias and conflict of interest, and how sometimes they're considered distinct and sometimes they overlap, but what conflicts of interest do we need to make sure get declared, etc. We've covered it a little bit on the show before, but it's definitely questions. We're now at 190 episodes, and so I won't make you go and search for all of that. It's come up enough times that we might as well go again and offer some angle on that. Want to bet you guys and get you involved. I'm sorry about some of the tech issues we've been having on some platforms. I know some of you that's commented on LinkedIn and say that they're not reaching me. I do see them afterwards, but yeah, I can't always draw them on screen and get you as involved as I'd like. I think that has been solved, and so please do get involved. If you're listening on LinkedIn, then please do send me your messages. But through whatever channel you're watching this, then please feel free to post comments. Firstly, to let me know and make sure that things are working. It's always good when you guys tell me if the video's not working or the audio's not working or whatever. Then the sooner you tell me that, the better. But also for you guys to get involved in a question and a topic that everyone should have an opinion on. And I don't necessarily mean a strong one. I don't mean that you've then know exactly where you stand on it. But it's just that it is something that most people, especially you lot, my thoughtful audience, are often pondering. Is that what are my biases? What are influencing my reasoning? What is influencing my decision making, my opinions? What is influencing me in my opinion? I mean, how much of that do I then want to share publicly, or even amongst my team or amongst my family and things? And then what is the intersection between that and the conflicts of interest that could need declaring underneath things? So, for example, let's go define terms a bit. And an example of a bias might be a favored preference for, say, squats, right? You just absolutely adore squats. You might have studied it, for example, or you enjoy doing them yourself, and you're a squat fanatic, and so you would be biased in favor of people that squat, that giving people squats to do as treatment, research about squatting, especially that then supports your opinion about squatting. That's a bias. And that bias could be considered then a conflict of interest. You're so into it. But where it becomes a conflict of interest more obviously and classically would be then if you're so into squatting that you then sell courses about squatting, and therefore you stand to gain from it. You wrote the book about squats, and you are therefore so invested in squatting that also you're biased in its favor, but you also have a conflict of interest that means that you stand to gain from more people being as into squats as you are. Therefore, it might further color your position. And that when say you then did write an editorial about squatting, or you wrote an editorial, or you wrote anything that then offered a heavy critique of someone that was anti-squats for some reason, then a conflict of interest is that you stand to gain, in this case overtly financially, from the proliferation of pro-squatting literature and action. Now, one of the things that I've said in the titles of this show, and what has kind of been coming up a lot in the comments and emails that I get, not just from Chewing It Over, but also just generally, obviously, the various hats I wear, Physio Matters, Choose Health, MSKR. We've been doing some interesting stuff recently, especially as the world tries to re-emerge from its various pandemic-related restrictions, is that people have been saying that financial conflict of interests are kind of really obvious, and the ways in which that might bias people to try and further an agenda and to help them both, help them in pocket. And that's not necessarily saying that's always a bad thing. It's like, let's not pretend that we're not influenced by by that, and that's inherently a bad thing. It's it'd be clumsy to think that always has to be a downside. But it's just that it is clearly something that would colour people's reasoning and their opinion and things like that. A lot of you have been asking about some of the other biases and conflicts of interest, the ones that go under the radar, and the ones that people are really frustrated at when someone might imply that someone's opinion is unduly biased, but then won't accept the charge in the other direction. And sometimes that feels tit for tat, right? So you might have been in situations where you say, I think you're being, you've clearly got that bias, and they go, yeah, but you're biased, and this is your bias, and this is your, and it starts to get a bit petty. But to some extent, one of the things I'm most suspect of is that when it's a shame when it's tit for tat and people are just acting out. But generally speaking, it is really frustrating if people think that they are somehow unbiased or haven't got a real grasp of their own, what it is that's informing and influencing us. Now, I'm not for a second meaning you're going to be able to get a handle on all of it, right? The human mind and consciousness is incredibly complex and so mysterious that it's unbelievable. And there's so many things that happen subconsciously and implicitly that might be affecting our opinions and convictions. So we're not going to get an understanding of all the complex ratios that are happening, but we should, in my opinion, be really aspiring to be as introspective as we can be about what it is that's influencing us and that's biasing us, and also be then interested in, but not accusatory, when trying to tease out what it is that might be biasing and influencing others, especially those that we're arguing against or opposing. And so one of the things I want to ask you guys, if you're tuning in live, then please do let me know, what's your take on bias and conflicts of interest? Do you think it's a big problem? Do you think it's overstated? Do you think that really because we've all got biases, then it doesn't really matter so much? I think what I'd be really interested in is, there are people out there that feel that it's overplayed and that it matters less, and then there are some people that feel that really that if we could scrutinize that in more detail, then everything will be more harmonious because everyone's kind of getting all the cards on the table and being more honest. So I want to know your opinion. If you're tuning in live, then let me know what's your take on this subject matter about what is, how important do you think bias and conflicts of interest are, and are we doing fairly well? Let's say in MSK and in healthcare, the sort of center of my universe, are we dealing with that well? So I'll leave that with you, and I'll just close the comments off for a second. So whilst I just give you my take, because that's often, it's a totally fair thing. I don't want to suddenly start. I do want to hear your thoughts, but equally, I'm not going to stop short and not give mine. So let me spit it out. One of the things that I've noticed, and one of the reasons why it's been, I think because I've been talking a bit about it, it's kind of cropped up and people have asked me to say more on it, is because it's almost the low-hanging fruit is to understand someone's financial conflicts of interest. Like, it's so obvious that if you have shares in a company that supports AI for MRI interpretation, right? So if you've got some company that's then you have shares in a company that would benefit greatly from the proliferation and adopting of AI to interpret MRI scans rather than human radiologists, sorry, I always get that wrong, radiologists, then it would be an obvious bias and a totally reasonable bias that you've kind of backed that horse, and that you are hopeful and supportive, and you're biased in that direction relative to not doing it, for example. And that it'd be smart to then declare that, admit it to yourself, admit it when talking about the subject matter that you're biased in that direction. But if you were to also then not admit to what would be a conflict of interest, and then masquerade as a neutral party in various different capacities, especially classically in research and evidence terms, but also just publicly, you were to not mention that you would stand to gain significantly from not just the technology, but the specific piece of, say, software. I'm making this up, by the way. This is not me failing to name names. I don't know who makes those, and I don't know who's got shares in them. But I'm just meaning that financial conflict of interest is kind of like, it's so obvious And it doesn't mean because it's obvious that it's therefore inherently corrupting. It's just that it's kind of like rarely goes under the radar, especially if it's known about. Publicly trading companies, people typically in healthcare will be like, I want to declare this bias and this conflict of interest in various different forms, including written if it's published material. However, we've kind of come to notice that when someone might say, well, you've got that conflict of interest, I'm going to either dismiss or that colours my opinion of your opinion, right? That compromises how legitimate I feel you are as a source because you have that bias and that conflict of interest. You would say that. Now, I think it's always a bit heavy-handed when people do that because I think it's a bit unfair to say, especially when someone's declaring openly, it's unfair to say that they could only hold that opinion because of that conflict of interest or that they are somehow being disingenuous or inaccurate. I think that would be a real shame when people imply that therefore is dismissible. I think that's such a shame. But I would also say that the thing that seems to have cropped up recently is people saying that just because someone hasn't got a financial conflict of interest that is as obvious and overt as that, then some biases run so deep that they can have a conflict of interest that then seems to go under the radar because it's one that could be described as, say, an ideological conflict of interest or a bias that is so deep that it is almost like a prior preferred epistemology or other lofty philosophical terms I could use, but like they are so biased in favor of, say, a reasoning heuristic or some way of knowing, way of doing. Even I mentioned about bias towards, say, something like squatting, is that if you're someone that is so committed and devoted to a really specific, say, school of thought, then that conflict or interest doesn't need to necessarily hit you in pocket really overtly. But as far as career aspirations go, and the fact that it then suits you and your identity and, say, your politics or your opinions and positions, then you stand to gain, even financially, through other means, right? If then you are seen as someone that was ahead of that, you would be, just because you're not then an overt, financial conflict of interest means you stand to gain directly from it. If that proliferates, you would benefit enormously, including in pocket, from being part of a movement that then is in vogue. And that it's sometimes been noted, and thank you for flagging that with me because I have noticed it myself, but it's like, there's no way, and that includes me, no one should underestimate just how deep those conflicts of interest and biases can run to influence things. So, for example, you can have a conflict of interest that's a sort of a deep ideological conflict of interest, whereby you would naturally struggle to see the opposite side of an argument that really confronts your own, say, politics or sense of self, right? It flies in the face of how you know your opinion, but also the world of which you know. Then that disagreement is not something that I'm saying is inherently bad, right? Because it happens, it's a fact, right? It's not, we're not all, I'm not saying we all should, if we communicated perfectly, we'd all be singing Kumbaya around a campfire. But when disagreements happen, I think sometimes people are quite, grab the low-hanging fruit of saying, well, your opinion's coloured by this conflict of interest because you stand to gain financially if that does well. Then on the counterpoint, if someone then says, well, you've got a conflict of interest where you're clearly deeply biased in that direction and you'd stand to gain from it not doing well, and say it's as binary as that, then the defense that seems to then occur from the person that hasn't got the obvious overt in-pocket benefit from that conflict is that they then think, well, no, that's not the case. I haven't got as much skin in the game as you're describing. And in this day and age, that is so naive. If you're in a movement or a wave of persuasive content that's then making someone, you're trying to propagate a certain, say, school of thought, modality, style of practice in the medical circumstances, but also, say, onto the wider policy implications, because we've also got this science and medical establishment that's influencing policy for good and bad, and some of it struggling to, and some of it influencing it. And I'm not saying it's going well, by the way, but I'm just meaning that estate of expert is then it's so clumsy if you think that they wouldn't have ideological conflicts of interest and then latently financial conflicts of interest on the position of their salary, right? If their style of, say, expertise or their style of opinion is to win out and be seen as valuable, and then more posts like it proliferate, and then there's a drive up of, say, salaries and the respect for that expertise that comes with salary, then you're going to see that in pocket. And so it's not that removed from said shareholder in a company of which they're touting such technologies, right? It's just so frustrating when otherwise smart minds might notice one example really obviously and be against it, and then just not recognize that sometimes on their side of a point or an argument, they are failing to notice it in themselves or those around them, because it's one stage slightly more removed. And it's not to say that it can be or should be mitigated completely, right? I'm saying this as this is in my opinion, this is just to be human, right? This happens, right? We have our biases, we have our conflicts of interest. I'd always prefer transparency and for these things to be known, but I'm not saying therefore they could all be leveled. I'm just meaning that the hypocrisy that I think occurs accidentally on this, because it's not quite as obvious or overt, and it feels a little bit cleaner somehow, is so naive and so frustrating for us trying to make progress. If you're not recognizing that these things could be coloring your judgment, then it's something that I just think we're not going to make the progress that we intend and that we hope for. And that's because we're being dismissive out of hand of things that could otherwise be valuable. And we're then overweighting people who think that they pass a purity test, that they are not ingrained in biases or conflicts of interest compared to X. And they then perceive and overweight that knowledge and those opinions and those people excessively, when a better balance of analysis would definitely get us in a better place. And I've spoken on this show before about coherence, right? I'm obsessed with the fact that it doesn't have to be consistent. It needs to be coherent. It needs to sort of make sense with what is otherwise known as best we can, right? It's like how when someone makes a suggestion and it flies in it totally flies in the face of what is otherwise known, or the same person's opinion the day before, is that coherence really matters. And that sometimes if we're making the pool of, say, expert, opinion maker, social media contributor of all levels, as well as then different, say, schools of thought or styles of practice or whatever it might be, all the different things that are happening. If we're dismissing some out of hand and then overweighting others because they seem to be passing some sort of arbitrary purity test on a superficial level, because we've not gone one step further and thinking, well, if you win out on that argument, you stand to gain financially for a few different other reasons. Not as overt as a shareholding, but it's just like, yeah, if that worked out for you, if people took that on, then you stand to gain enormously from that. And I think it's such a shame if we miss out on recognizing it. And so yeah, I asked earlier, and I'll ask you again, as to what is your opinion on this? What do you feel are under or over recognized biases? Do you think it's overplayed? Do you think it's underplayed? Are we bothered about it? So yeah, I'm fascinated in this topic, and certainly I'm not going to pretend I've got the obvious magic answer as to how to solve it if it is a problem. But I'm not convinced it's that much of a problem. It's definitely one that's just come up amongst you lot, like you've been asking me quite regularly about that and to talk about it and my opinion on it, because I've been outspoken before about some obvious and overt conflicts of interest that have occurred, especially when they've not been declared. And I think that generally I'm someone that is always looking at the world through a lens of understanding that biases and conflicts of interest in how people might be ideologically thinking. And why, not what do you think, but why do you think that? And then if you ask that question, especially because I ask that question a lot in various different settings, why do you think that? And then they explain as to why it's, that they've come to that opinion, and that they sometimes, because that's the water in which they swim, right? They look through the world through that lens. That's their deep bias that becomes almost their foundations. they sometimes fail to recognize it. It's such a shame, because if we fail to recognize that we are all biased, then we're all susceptible to various conflicts of interest, which will color all of our interactions and our opinions. If you're kidding yourself to think that you're interacting with the world as a neutral, then it's just going to be a breakdown in any common sense conversation. It's going to spoil it, really. It's like, you're biased, but I'm not. So, grow up, not cool. So yeah, I've asked as to what your take is on it. So thank you so much to Ian. So can I pull this onto the screen? No, I can't. Ian said he thinks it's underplayed and that bias affects everything. All right, thanks, Ian. I agree on some part. I don't think, and I'll ask Ian if you're still listening, whether or not you think it affects everything and that's a bad thing. Is that what you're meaning? Or are you just saying it does it? So yeah, Ian, get back to me. Yeah, the clicking's not working here. Sorry. Yeah. Sandra says that Sandra says, sometimes it's hard to understand as to what people actually think. Maybe they're just signaling that they want to be on a certain team or tribe. Now, that's an interesting one, isn't it? So how much is it that people are actually declaring biases and opinions that they do hold, or how much is it that they're almost succumbing to the bandwagon effect? Yeah, it's interesting. And then the sort of tribal thinking as well that can occur on it is that often happens, doesn't it? Is that when you've got clusters of biased people or biases tend to get together in special interest groups and lobbies and friendship groups, and those can sometimes become tribes and adversarial in many ways, where they kind of end up getting together to try and fight against something that they want to change, and that's how things happen. And obviously that can then extend into, say, politics and religions and factions, and then unfortunately then there can be sort of ugly sides of that, but there can also be really good things that come of that, where you've got different opinions and different groups of people that then the sweet spot is in the friction between them, right? The energy comes from the friction between two opposing ideas that you've got to then grapple with. And then if you aspire for it to be coherent, then that's great. And so, yeah, thanks, Sandra, for your comment about potentially, is it people just wanting to join a tribe or a team? I think sometimes it is that. And I think that it'd be clumsy of us, though, to think that that's all the time. It's this idea that sometimes people, especially when it comes to, say, ideological conflicts of interest and opinions and teams, especially at the moment, it's a bit toxic out there, isn't it? Twitter's the worst for it, but generally it's not just in social media, in the world, really. There's lots of people with strident opinions sat on pub bar stools and various other circumstances where they've got strident opinions that they want to share. Means that those conflicts of interest and biases are being more vocal and sometimes feel incompatible. It don't feel like good conversation can come of that, which is a shame. I think, if I'm honest, we need to get past that somehow. And I think that to be sort of more open and honest with it would be smart. I think it's therefore not fair if people say that when people are saying anything to any effect, it's only because they're virtue signaling or wanting to attach himself to a team or tribe, as Sandra said. And I know she's not meaning all the time, but I mean, if you suggest that that's people being performative all the time, that's a shame. But equally, I don't agree that that's never motivating people, right? Some people do want to sort of signal to the group, to the tribe, that they're a good person, or that they hold that opinion, or that they can be trusted on a topic like this, and I agree with you, and this is how we're going to make it clear. And sometimes that can be to the negative, right? If someone's it's like if you know any actors or performers, if you knew that they were behaving off stage as they are on stage just because they're talented at acting, then you're not going to really manage to get much of a relationship with them, because they're not being authentic, they're not being true, and social media does just skew towards a performative element, because often it's so public. But I think it's sort of a bit clumsy when people then accuse someone, say, of virtue signaling or biasing it towards the tribe or team purely because they disagree with it, right? Their opinion is fair, and someone else's opinion that they disagree with is simply just virtue signaling. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not there at all, and sometimes it's in between. That's the nature of the beast. So what do you think is the main issue with financial conflicts of interest then? I think that the main issue with it is if it goes undeclared, and therefore it's that being disingenuous that matters. There are some people that think that, well, being declared or undeclared doesn't matter. It's the fact that that is influencing people's behaviour that is the either issue that needs to be corrected for, or that it doesn't matter. I end up being in a bit of a middle ground on this, where I feel that declaration actually does get you at least 2/3 of the way there. It should therefore be understood, recognised and accounted for, but particularly in scientific and evidence-based circumstances. Excuse me, sorry, I'm boring myself. Then I think it can be made, it can be levelled. It can be levelled in the most part. For fun, because it's kind of obvious, isn't it? I stand to gain financially from this, and it still means I believe in it and I believe in my arguments, but I believe in them so much that I've then ended up tethering my pay to it. Then you want to account for that. But I think you could argue that what is the problem with it, which is the question. The problem is that if it was, even when it's declared, the problem could be that it's colouring judgment and that it's really bending someone out of shape. They're too deeply committed to a particular conclusion. And I said, I don't care what the conclusion is if you started with it. So if you started with the conclusion in any topic, you think, I wonder what I think about that. And you start with a conclusion and then work back from there and justify your conclusion, which, by the way, sort of neurologically and psychologically, that is absolutely how humans behave. It's that you come up with a premise and then you spend your time justifying that premise. And so that is to human. I'm not therefore going to correct that, but I'm just admitting that is just a real shame on a complex matter if that is massively affecting someone's outcome of their opinion. And so what is the problem with it is that if just finance and monetary gain is so strongly influencing someone's opinion, because they can't see a world or can't comprehend a world in which they would think the opposite. I think that would be a shame. It would be a shame, and it often is. If people, and the way to sort of mitigate that is to try to make sure that we have opportunities for people, particularly people in our industry, in healthcare, to not have all their eggs in one basket, right? And so that when the mistakes that have been made in yesteryear, where you've got therapists and educators that end up just tripling down on a particular style of practice or modality, the opportunity for them to be able to reform their opinions and to soften their stance and to become less devoted to that forever and a day, we need to therefore try to uncouple the motives from those modalities and schools of thought, and to remember that it should be the patients that should be out of it, right? Because the problem with financial conflicts of interest is that they often just make people more and more blinkered, more and more narrow, and fail to see the big picture, and we all fail to gain from that. So yeah, we're out of time. Thank you so much for your comments and questions, and thank you for inspiring this episode about bias. Main thing being, and the title, as you can see there, Know You're Biased, is that unfortunately I don't think any of us are immune to it, and that if you think that you're willing to dismiss someone's opinion because you feel it's biased and you happen to disagree with it, then one of the reasons that you disagree with it is because you're biased too. It doesn't mean it's like for like. It doesn't mean that one of you's got more of a handle on it than the other. But generally speaking, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves as to how biased we are, but also how they can then turn into conflicts of interest of all different flavors, including ones that say are ideological, that might not necessarily directly implicate people, get people benefiting in pocket directly, but in time, that is exactly what's happening, and they're not that much different. And so understanding each other's priors and foundations and positions that influence us is really important. And I think that the more we can talk about that, the better. And I look forward to doing that. So more so with you guys, especially because you seem to be interested in it, having come up now a second time. I'm pretty sure this second episode of this kind, although hopefully not too repetitive to those that have listened in or watched the last one. So yeah, thanks a lot, and I'll see you tomorrow. Cheers, everyone. Bye.